So forest and rangeland management, which is inherently place-based, requires a localized workforce and the infrastructure to support it. This capacity is a key component of the conversation we talk about as the provision of services in rural communities. Without the people, the expertise, roads, housing, and more that is needed at the community level, this critical work cannot occur. Our last panel today, Preparing Communities for Federal Land Management Funds, will discuss efforts to build capacity for forest and rangeland management and highlight the gaps that still exist. The first of our impressive panelists is our moderator, Nils Christofferson. Nils is the Executive Director of Wallowa Resources. Nils has a diverse experience in place-based natural resource management from working around the world, including ranching in Australia, farming in Israel, fishing and forestry in Norway, and forestry and wildlife in Southern Africa. Pretty impressive. He's passionate about working landscapes and the role of rural communities in their stewardship and holds an MS in forestry from Oxford University. He currently serves on the Oregon Board of Forestry and the World Forest Center's Board of Directors. Nils, all yours.
All right, thanks, Jack. And just a little point of correction, I'm no longer on the Board of Forestry. I termed out, but greetings, everybody. Appreciate all of you sticking with us. And if there are any Norwegians in the audience, happy 17th of May. It's our Independence Day. I'm honored to be moderating this session today. It addresses a subject I've been passionate about for pretty much my whole career and the last quarter century about in the rural West. And that's the importance of investing in the people, land, and natural resources across this fabulous landscape that we call home. And this idea of trying to build capacity and to build the partnerships with federal, state, tribal, local entities, public-private partnerships as well, that's been the story of Wallowa Resources since we were created back in 1996 at the leadership of our county commissioners who are trying to figure out how to respond to the loss of our forest products industry, which were our largest private sector payroll provider. And part of it, I think people saw then and see increasingly over time that as we've lost our industry partners and our workforce, it's put us in a tough position now as we need that local capacity more than ever to respond to the various needs of restoration, stewardship, and management across the West. So it's exciting to be moderating this panel today. You know, beyond losing the workforce, rural, I think probably people saw the news that and have been feeling it, but it's official. Rural counties have lost population over the last decade, and that's the first time that's happened in the history of the United States. And Western rural communities bucked the trend if they were retirement communities or amenity communities. But communities where people were really connected to the natural resources, to the land, continued to shrink as a result of the same trends that we've been experiencing now for many decades. And those trends pose real challenges to federal land management, to the stewardship of private lands, and all lands restoration efforts that are gearing up across the West in response to wildfire risk and a broad range of conservation and rural revitalization goals that require aligned effort across property lines by federal, state, tribal, and local government, and of course, private landowners. We need more people working on the ground in our communities, working on these issues. Contributing to that rural population decline is the significant loss in federal government staff stationed in our rural communities. In Eastern Oregon, since the 1990s, Forest Service staff is reduced by 67% for the 3 Blue Mountain forests. And there's been significant declines too in the rural development staff. As a result, across the rural West, we're not well positioned to take advantage of this unprecedented levels of federal funding available to support public and private land management today. But this panel is going to explore that. How do we rebuild capacity, develop the workforce, and maintain and expand the infrastructure we need to advance forest and rangeland management. And the panel will also highlight the gaps that exist, the problems we still need to wrestle with. So with that, I'm going to invite a new colleague of mine, Laurel Harkness, who is the director of the Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition. It's a coalition of community-based groups across the West. I serve on the leadership team for that coalition, and Will Our Resources is actually the fiscal sponsor of the coalition. It used to be managed by another group out of Portland, Sustainable Northwest, and about 6-7 years ago, we took on the fiscal sponsorship. Laura, I'll let you offer additional introduction of yourself.
Yeah, no pressure. I'm sitting next to my boss, and we've got some big problems to solve here. So, but yeah, so no, I'm Laurel Harkness, and I'm here from California. Actually, there are rural counties in California, and I'm glad to have a colleague in the room that represents the rural counties. So I live in Siskiyou County in Mount Shasta. It's a town of 3 stoplights, graduating class of 50. And I just sent my youngest off to college in Washington State, and I'm not sure I'm ever going to get my 2 kids back to the rural community, so we're contributing to the depopulation problem. I lived in that community for about 20 years. I grew up in the rural Sierra foothills as well, so my whole life has been in rural communities. And so now that you know a little bit about me, I want to know a little bit more about you. So who lives in a rural community currently? This is really helpful. Okay, so who grew up in a rural community? Keep your hands up. Okay, great. And who's visited a rural community? Okay, excellent. Okay, so we have some common ground here, some appreciation for rural, and I kid you not, I'm in rooms sometimes where that's not always the case. So I'll start out, just thanks for being here, thanks for hanging in there for the whole day here. So we're talking about capacity building in rural communities to prepare for these generational investments. So we're primarily talking about the IIJA, so the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, and these funds are coming down for forest and rangeland management, and it's generational funding. And when you talk about what success looks like, after this funding is expended, I think that's a point of reflection. I'd like to invite you all to sort of think about what is success, if we get all this money on the ground. And depending on who you talk to, you get sort of different definitions. And so, I want to kind of invite you to consider, what if we measure the effectiveness of this generational funding coming through these federal funding sources for forest and rangeland management? What if we measure it not by whether we've actually expended the funds, just start there, and not by acres treated or wildfire loss avoidance, but rather measure the effectiveness by how successfully we grow capacity in rural communities and stimulate the stewardship economy across the western states. So flip it. It's not just about spending the money as quickly as possible and getting it all on the ground and out the door. Like, what if we pause and think about how to actually build capacity in rural communities? And I want to talk a little bit about the stewardship economy. So, and I might kick it back to Nils at some point here, but this is something that resonates with me, and I think you all will all understand. But the stewardship economy is an economy shaped by the need and responsibility to manage for the sustainability of both land and community. So it's really about the rural communities being connected with the landscapes and their interdependence on one another. And I'm sure you come across this too. You hear different variations on stewardship economy, whether it's restoration economy, whether it's regenerative economy, blue economy, green economy, bioeconomy, lots of different economies. But I'm going to encourage you to really consider adopting stewardship economy as a term. I think it resonates in rural communities. Stewardship's a verb. I think, no matter who you're talking with in rural communities, I think they can relate to being a steward of that place. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the levels of funding coming down and the programs that they're coming through. And, on most days I imagine like one of those game show, like money blowing machines, like an air tunnel with like dollar bills. Like I kid you not, like this shows up my dreams sometimes, like, oh geez, and we're all trying to figure out like what the best way to like capture the dollar bills is. And this is like a real problem in rural communities. And they're stressed out. There's like a lot of FOMO. They see, oh no, another grant announcement and the grant deadline's in 4 weeks and I've got no grant writer and I've got to get a resolution in front of the county supervisors, and they only meet once a month, and there's so many barriers, and so there's some real gaps that are growing, I think, when you've got these levels of funding and you've got rural communities that don't really have capacity to even go after the grants to grow capacity. It takes capacity to get capacity. So, and I'll remind you where I'm from. I'm from Northern California. We live in a land of frequent wildfire, and a lot of in any given year, 2 or so communities in my county burn to the ground. So and there's a lot of communities that are experiencing incredible amounts of loss and trauma due to wildfire, and they're still years later after the fires trying to figure out how to get people back in homes and deal with CDBG-DR and all these other sort of recovery mechanisms, and so sort of add on to it these sort of opportunities to grow capacity through the IIJA and the IRA, and it's hurtful. So I'll just leave it there. So we need to systematically remove some barriers to all these funding programs. So let's talk about the good stuff, though. So getting back to what success is for the funding, if we talk about rural community benefit, let's talk about equity and access to this capital. And, rural communities have some challenges in not having human capacity, organizational capacity, and so forth. And so, making sure that these programs in their endeavor to reach pace and scale sort of build in mechanisms to provide equity to access this capital, and there's a few different ways to do that, and I think some of the ways we're seeing are in through the flexibility in re-granting and also deploying sort of sub-grantee arrangements in these funds coming down, and there's some real nuance in the program design, and I think we all agree that there needs to be a little bit of a rural lens on some of these programs and making sure that we're not inadvertently excluding underserved communities, tribes, and rural communities as well. So designing the programs for rural community benefits would be a game changer. I want to talk a little bit about community capital, and I love how we've touched on prosperity, we've touched on wealth today. Think about like a capitals framework when we talk about community capital, and there's 7 different buckets that I see for community capital. So we've got natural, human, social, cultural, political, financial, and built, and we can't just address one aspect of community capital. We've got to grow them all simultaneous to each other, and so there's some real art form, I think, to growing community capital in rural communities in particular, and it requires some really it's like building a Lego ship or something. So think about capital stacking and finding different sources of your capital, because I think it was touched on earlier today that a lot of the public funding sources are somewhat inflexible in what they'll fund. And so you've got to have some more flexible sources kind of woven in with the inflexible sources, and so that requires a multitude of funding sources. So I think that having some technical assistance available to communities to advise them on the art form that is capital stacking is incredibly beneficial. And also, we touched on it earlier today too, the public and private partnerships are immensely important. And I think now, more than ever in the era of the nature-based solutions and the levels of institutional investment coming down, these are great times for rural communities to build relations across into those investment communities. So before I hand it off, I wanted to talk a little bit about a unicorn of the West. And there are some of them, but this one in particular, I want to talk about community scale sawmill. I don't know if you know how many sawmills your state has lost over the last few decades, but I'm from California, and I know that it's over 200 sawmills, and I think there's a need, as we're addressing fuels reduction and the wildfire crisis strategy and implementing that and making sure we have a way to capture community benefit from the wood coming out of the forests. And unfortunately, we've lost a network of those small community sawmills in the West. And I'd like to offer a good example, a unicorn that happens to be in Montana here, and it's Mark's Lumber. Does anyone know Mark's Lumber in Clancy, Montana? So apparently, it was awarded the Forest Products Award by the governor in 2021 because they partnered with the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation and the Helena, Lewis, and Clark National Forest on a Good Neighbor Authority project. And so they conserved 30,000 acres in support of wildfire fuels reduction. But this is an 80-year-old family-owned mill. They employ 25 people in a small community, sustainable business model, 2 million board feet a year, which really isn't much, but what they've managed to do is they've found the highest and best value of that wood, and they use a circular saw and make it beautiful. So everybody that wants a home, like all the beautiful, commercial buildings you see in Bozeman here, you can, use these panels from Mark's Lumber, and sort of recreate that. So, if we could replicate that size of a mill in about 100 other places across the western states, I think we might make a dent in the wood utilization problem and opportunity that we've got. I wanted to mention community-based collaborative capacity. This is something that Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition it leans into. This is a cross-cutting core of our policy work, and we're activated on the Farm Bill in this area. We've got a whole set of recommendations that are squarely focused on community collaborative capacity, and there's some very, very important authorities and programs that are covered in the Farm Bill that need reauthorization in order to continue to advance collaborative capacity in rural communities. And I think I'm going to leave it there because I'm sure I'm over time, but I do want to circle back to housing, and I know we're going to talk about that. So.
Thanks, Laurel. I appreciate it. And for people who are interested in Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition, they do have a good website, and they're going to have an annual meeting in South Lake Tahoe in November. That has usually been a really fabulous opportunity for people to discuss many of the same issues we're talking about here today, and think about how collectively we can raise our voice with our federal partners. So turning to that, I'm very honored to introduce John Crockett, the Associate Director, Deputy Chief of State, Private, and Tribal Forestry for the United States Forest Service. John, I'll let you add more introduction. I appreciate your reputation and my understanding of your real keen commitment to collaboration and partnerships with the state government, local communities, county governments, and a big investment recently in tribal governments with the co-stewardship agreements. And so it's a real honor to be here with you.
Thanks, Neil. So how's my audio? Am I going to have to lean into the mic, or can I just be a little bit more relaxed? A little bit more relaxed. I'm good? See thumbs up. All right, I'll take it. And I know we're late in the day, we're low energy, we're the last panel before you guys get to hang out at the reception, so I'm gonna share some nuggets, whet your appetite, hopefully you can get more from the Q&A session if you want to grab more. We can always follow up later. But I am John Crockett. I'm Associate Deputy Chief for State, Private, and Tribal Forestry. Been with the agency for 25 years. Past 10 years of that has been in DC, working at our national headquarters on forest policy issues. I'm a forester by trade. I grew up in rural Alabama, so I'm not a Westerner, but I do understand the needs of rural communities, but I also want to share a little bit more with you about like breaking down the Forest Service, because I'm sure when many of you guys think about the Forest Service, you think about your favorite national forest, which would be expected. I work on a different part of the agency. So for the past 3 years, I've been in state, private, and tribal forestry, and we just recently added that tribal component to our name in January of this year. The Office of Tribal Relations has been part of our deputy area since its existence about 10 or 12 years ago, but it wasn't like part of the name. And we recognize how important it was for tribal entities when they're either coming to the Washington office or they're engaging with us, that they can hear their name represented in the work that we do. So state, private, and tribal forestry, it used to be state and private forestry, and there's a lot in that name. So we work directly with states through federal appropriations that go to states for technical assistance, for landowner assistance work in communities. And the funding that we receive through both the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, are putting dollars directly into communities. So I know that's what we're here to talk about. That's what you want to hear. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of like maybe you didn't know about state, private, and tribal forestry. Maybe you just knew about the national forest system, which most people do. They think about their favorite national forest. And that's where the majority of the funds are going, because that's where we have the majority of the fire issue. And wouldn't be the Forest Service, wouldn't be able to have be part of a panel if I didn't recognize the fact that we are in the middle of a wildfire crisis. And we put together a strategy last year to impact that wildfire crisis, to disrupt it. And part of that was announcing, in April of last year, we announced that we would have 11 projects that would be the first round of projects that would be those disruptors. This year, we added 11 additional projects to it. And so if you ask anybody in the Forest Service what their priorities are, and this is a quote from the chief, they should be able to say, we have a priority of disrupting the system around the wildfire crisis strategy, starting with our 21 initial landscapes, and then branching out from there. We've talked about these dollars being a down payment from Congress, and so if we can demonstrate how we're being effective with these funds in this first round of a down payment, then obviously it's going to open up the door for additional appropriated dollars in the future. So a lot of what I'm going to be sharing is connected to that, but I want to share some nuggets that are going to be directly beneficial for you on how to access federal funds, because those federal funds are going to federal lands and doing treatments on federal lands, and we're working with partners on ways to do that. But there are also some dollars that can come directly from the federal government directly to communities. So let me share a couple of more nuggets on that before I stop with the introductory remarks and we go on with the conversation. We've implemented this concept called community navigators, and we're using a portion of the funds to be able to define or put resources in communities to do exactly what Laurel described around, I don't know how to apply for a grant. I don't have the capacity to be able to even know how to chase it. The community navigator concept will take our existing authorities through working with state government and nonprofit and tribal organizations and expand that. So it's a new concept. We actually just hired our program manager yesterday, and so we're building it out. The first phase, we're starting with a small group of organizations who are already ready to go with implementing this concept, and then we're going to expand into phase 2. And so phase 1 is going to be basically from now through the summer, end of the summer. Phase 2 is going to be picking up after the end of the summer, looking to expand out to more organizations who have the ability to impact the work, and then launching it out. So with this concept, we won't be able to put one in every community. So some of them might be regional based. Some of them might land in a community. We're still building it out. So if you want more information on that, definitely we can follow it up. Another area where we've put a lot of emphasis as an agency on expanding capacity is through a concept called Keystone Agreements. A lot of the funding that we've got, obviously we can't spend it all as an agency. Even if we do our pass-through funds directly to states, they might not necessarily have the capacity to be able to spend it all. And so we're partnering with organizations who have the infrastructure in place to be able to build out that capacity. So I'm going to give you the ones that we've started with. So National Forest Foundation, Mule Deer Foundation, National Wild Turkey Federation, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the Nature Conservancy, Trout Unlimited, and the Student Conservation Association. Those are the partners that we've, in this first round, we've said we're putting funds in your organizations for you to expand capacity that's going to help us be successful with implementing the wildfire crisis strategy on the ground. As we were going through, so that's a list of partners that you've probably heard of in one way or another. One of the things that we wanted to be really intentional around is how do we make sure and value the voice of tribal communities. So what we decided to do was set aside $100 million just for a tribal Keystone Agreement, and we're building it out as we speak. The Intertribal Timber Council is going to be a major component of that. We've worked with ITC in the past to be able to do a lot of the work on the ground with the Tribal Forest Protection Act and various authorities that we have in place. And we're trying to find other tribal entities to help expand out. We don't want it to be with just one, because as Don said in the earlier panel, he didn't represent all of the voices of Indian country. ITC doesn't as well, and so we've heard that loud and clear. So anyway, love any ideas that you have on how to expand out on a tribal Keystone Agreement that's in place. And we think we've got about 70 million that we need to still figure out, like what's the right organization to land it. So anyway, love some thoughts on that. I knew this was going to happen. I've got so much content to share. I'm going to hit a couple of high points, and then we'll see what we can grab in the Q&A session. Another component is our landscape scale restoration program. And so we've had the authority for a while, but it came with a different set of expectation. And this is around supporting landowners to do climate resilient work on the forest. And so we have about $450 million that's allocated to us. And I'm going to give you the breakdown of the provisions. $150 million provide direct cost share assistance for underserved landowners to implement climate change projects. Provision 2 provides, provisions 2 and 3, 150 and 100 provides assistance for underserved communities who have small acreage, 2,500 acres or less, and then giving them access to new and changing markets. And then the fourth provision is $50 million that provides a new direct challenge cost share for activities that sequester carbon on private lands. And we're working with our state forest organizations and American Forest Foundations and a couple of other partners on building out what that would look like. There will be a capacity building grant opportunity that's associated with that, because we're talking about assisting private landowners with these dollars. So more to come on that. And then the last thing that I want to share is an opportunity that's on the street now through our urban and community forestry program. And we received historic, record-breaking, once-in-a-career, once-in-a-lifetime funding opportunities related to this program. Traditionally, it went from a traditional high of $40 million to $1.5 billion, a $1.5 billion program. We put $250 million out to states already for them to do sub-ward granting opportunities related to those dollars, with a focus on impacting underserved communities. And the current notice of funding opportunity closes on June 1st. And there's an opportunity for states can apply to that grant opportunities as well. Or if you're a community and you want to apply directly to the Forest Service to receive it and be a sub-grantor, that opportunity is there as well. So I think I'll leave it at that and save the rest for Q&A. Thanks.
All right, thanks, John. Thank you very much. So our next panelist is Joshua Sloan. I've just only recently met him, but I'm very pleased to introduce Joshua. He's an assistant professor of forestry at New Mexico Highlands University and the principal investigator of New Mexico Highland University's National Science Foundation Center of Research Excellence in Science and Technology, which focuses specifically on forest restoration, research, outreach, engagement, and workforce development. He also is as a founder of the New Mexico Reforestation Center, which is a partnership of the university with the state New Mexico Forestry Division. Real pleasure to have you here, and feel free to elaborate on your bio.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you, Niels. So my full fancy title is the Associate Vice President of Academic Affairs for Forestry and the Reforestation Center. A little bit of context where I'm coming from in New Mexico and the relevance maybe for some other states and how you're thinking about tackling some of these challenges. In New Mexico, my institution, New Mexico Highlands University, houses the only forestry education program in the state. Typically, that would be at a land-grant university in most states. In New Mexico, that's not the case. Our forestry program is actually housed at a small regional comprehensive university, about 3,000 students. So, you know, about the size of actually some of our counties in New Mexico, but kind of on the small side. And I got there in 2017 in an interesting situation. So the university was basically on the verge of losing its forestry program, which, as I mentioned, was the only forestry program in the state. And so we're talking about all of these massive landscape level challenges to addressing our resource management issues in the West. And we have those on the ground, but we also have those challenges with regard to the institutions who are responsible for that workforce development. And I think a lot of times that's less visible to many folks, policymakers included. So I was recruited to address some of those challenges, which we did successfully. And in the process, we had the opportunity of really stepping back and looking at our challenges, looking at our opportunities, and looking at our responsibility to our state for serving in that capacity of workforce development with regards to forestry, with regards to natural resource management across the landscape. And what I can share from that, I guess, is a couple of interesting stories as to how we've approached that and how we've addressed some of these challenges and opportunities that John and Laurel have pointed out. Before I forget about it, so kind of interesting note, Siskiyou County, I was there last year, first time. We actually hosted the nation's first ever tree seed summit there last year, focusing on addressing tree seed collection challenges for reforestation nationwide. So a lot of pretty cool work coming out of that area even. Now, my background personally, like John, I'm a forester. So I got into this coming from an operational forest management background. I'm a certified forester with Society of American Foresters. So if anybody wants to like nerd out about kind of on the ground technicalities, we can go all night at the reception. And my personal specialty is in reclamation, reforestation, basically post-disaster recovery on forested landscapes. I've been doing that for about 20 years now. I really had to shift gears coming into more of an administrative and policy role and program development role at Highlands University. And one of the first contacts I made there was State Forester Laura McCarthy, who came on with the state pretty shortly after I did. And one of the tools that I kind of want to bring to the forefront of people's thoughts as far as how states interact with federal government and how they help their communities interact with the federal government, a state's forest action plan actually provides a pretty robust and important policy tool for identifying and outlining both those challenges, opportunities at the community and state level, as well as identifying potential actors within the state that can help address those issues, and then can also facilitate interaction with our federal agencies. Because, if anybody like John mentioned that, there are kind of silos within the Forest Service, and there are similar situations with silos in many federal agencies. And a lot of times at the community level, folks don't have that background. They don't have that knowledge or understanding of those internal silos within agencies, or which agencies are within which departments, and what the boundaries are there. And we can maybe get into some of that later in the Q&A. But when we were faced with kind of these workforce challenges combined with the need for programs to meet those workforce challenges, combined with the massive need for actual on-the-ground achievements, when we were looking at that in the ballpark of 2018, 2019, which also happened to coincide with the revision of New Mexico's Forest Action Plan, as the state's only forestry education institution, we were brought into that. And so we were able to work with our state forester in that case to develop a strategy to simultaneously pull in all these different players, different institutions across the state, including tribal governments, including the tribal natural resource management agencies, including private sector, and figure out really who should be doing what and who should be taking the lead on what. And I feel like a lot of times that's one of the places where these gaps happen, is in that kind of coordination. And I feel like states are in a rather unique position to try to address that, particularly state forestry and natural resource management organizations are in a good position to bridge those gaps. In our case, what came out of this was a couple of parallel endeavors with a lot of overlap, but kind of different scales and different areas of focus. One, like Niels mentioned in the introduction, is we came up with a plan and a proposal, and we put an application into the National Science Foundation. And that was for our institution, for our Department of Forestry at Highlands University, to become a Center for Research Excellence in Science and Technology. And we were successful in that. So we became the country's only NSF CREST Center focused on reforestation and forest restoration. What the architecture of that proposal basically entailed was a proposal to sort of develop an improved feedback model between our academic curriculum and our workforce development programs that would interact more intentionally with communities and agencies. So on the one hand, bringing employers into the conversation to provide them a mechanism for direct feedback into our workforce development programs. On the other hand, developing an intentional framework for our educational institution to go out into those communities and have a two-way conversation. On the one hand, hear from them what they need, what problems they're trying to solve, what they need in terms of workforce and skill sets, but then the reverse, which is, again, in most states, the extension function of the land grant university in the state, but in our case, because forestry is housed at a regional comprehensive, we ended up being largely taking the lead on that forestry outreach. And so we also incorporated this intentional aspect of us going out to those communities to communicate to them translated research findings, best management practices. And so all of this kind of happening as one big ongoing conversation of hearing from them what they need in terms of workforce skills, anything else resource management related, while at the same time trying to get that information and those skills and opportunities back to them, which also relates to these grant opportunities. Because universities are in a relatively unique position, sort of like states, in that we have, I think, by nature, by design, more of an ability to interact more fluidly with more stakeholder groups, more opportunities, more entities, be they state, federal, private, NGO, tribal, across the board. And that's something, I guess, kind of a message I'd like to share that follows on from that last panel, is these conversations with universities and between sectors and universities can be really pivotal to improving outcomes on the landscape. And then final thing to mention, and I'll wrap this up and we can chat later, is the formation also as a result of that State Forest Action Plan of the New Mexico Reforestation Center, which is a partnership actually between 3 universities in the state and our state's forestry division. And we designed from the ground up on the basis of the goals and objectives in the state's newest Forest Action Plan. We came up with a strategy to address our state's reforestation needs in perpetuity. We designed out the infrastructure, we came up with all the programmatic design, we pulled in all of those relevant partners to serve as collaborators on it, which is how we ended up with 3 universities in the state's forestry division. And some of the lessons coming out of that I think a lot of our agencies and folks could benefit from is really looking past trying to establish organizational ownership over things and really going back to that service, that public service mission that all of our institutions were founded on. And if that means that I need to partner with 2-year community colleges and hand over grants, delegate to them certain technical training programs, and then work with them to figure out how that articulates to us for a 4-year for those students for whom that makes sense. And then we articulate to maybe New Mexico State University or University of New Mexico, who can grant PhDs to get that higher level. And then at the same time, partnering with private sector to build those on-the-job, technical training programs we need. A mention came up of the need for firefighters, and that's one of the areas that we've developed programs in that we're working on. Really we kind of adopted this, everything and the kitchen sink approach to pulling in everybody we possibly can to develop those workforce development opportunities and figure out how we can use our institutions as a conduit for these federal resources to get out into the communities, including that grant management support. And final closing thing on that, in some cases we actually serve as a fiscal agent for counties through the university to help them receive and manage these projects. For at the community level, we can kind of provide that administrative and coordination capability. So happy to field questions on anything and everything here in a bit.
All right, thanks, Josh.
Sure.
And building on that theme of the important role that universities and states play in working directly with rural communities, we've got Autumn Coleman here, the Bureau Chief with the Montana Department of Natural Resources. In that capacity, she works with all the staff across the Resource Development Bureau to provide grants and loans to communities and private citizens to reclaim, conserve, and develop Montana's natural resources. She's been doing natural resource work for almost 2 decades, a lot in mine reclamation, and recently has been extremely busy securing and delivering over $400 million in federal ARPA funds to support water and sewer infrastructure development across communities across the great state of Montana. So, Autumn.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. And I'm not going to talk a lot about forestry, but I hope when I talk about this unprecedented investment in water and sewer infrastructure, you'll be able to find the corollary or the common language between me rambling on about infrastructure and some of the themes that you guys are looking for. So My name again is Autumn Coleman, and I work for the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation in Montana, which is one of those state organizations that does receive the federal funds from U.S. Forest Service to implement those on-the-ground projects. So DNRC is a pretty diverse agency. We have the water resources folks that do water rights and floodplain, amongst many other things. We have our fire and forestry group. We have state lands that manage all of the state-owned lands in Montana. We also have the oil and gas division that manages those oil and gas leases. I'm with the division that does provide funding for projects that deliver on our agency's mission. So I'm in charge of grants and loans, which you would think would make me incredibly popular. But I don't necessarily think that's the case. And to Laurel's point, for the last 2 years, I've been running that cash grab machine, just cramming money into a machine and yelling into a microphone. And no, for the last 2 years with DNRC, we were basically given the responsibility to dole out over 400, and I actually counted it up, it's $425 million in ARPA funds across the state of Montana to local governments. We didn't do it alone. We had a really great team with the Montana Department of Commerce, Montana Department of Environmental Quality, and our governor's office. That was to deliver necessary investments to water and sewer infrastructure, and it made up the majority of Montana's ARPA funds. So the Montana legislature wanted to take their ARPA funds that came to the state of Montana and reinvest that in their communities in water and sewer infrastructure. So we had an incredibly big spotlight on us as we rolled out this grant program. And I want to just give a little bit of background on these water and sewer grants, only just to provide context, because I do think that it's resembles and is very similar to what they're pushing out in the grant funds in the federal infrastructure bills. So basically, we had about 1 month to come up with a grant program. We had about 1 month to let people apply. And we had about 1 month to do the ranking and review and recommendations for those. So our first round of grant opportunities, we had $125 million in that grant round to give away. We received over $900 million in applications from anywhere from irrigation districts to conservation districts to school districts, cities and counties and towns and water and sewer districts. So we've been growing, and to be clear, this is federal funds coming to the state of Montana, so we're the middleman, and we are subgranting them out to smaller communities to do this work. That was 2 years ago is when we started, and 2 years later, right now we're managing over 450 grants for projects, including to Miles Community College. I guess it was Ron that was speaking in the last panel. We have a grant to Miles Community College for like $129,000 for them to replace their grease interceptor and sewer line. So anyway, he took off, but I was going to say you're welcome. But when I talk about these water and sewer projects, I apologize that it kind of goes on about infrastructure and water and sewer, but I hope that you are picking up when I'm using my industry's vernacular, that there are themes or that we can correlate the language that you guys use in more of the natural resource land management. I also just wanted to mention that my background very quickly is I actually graduated from MSU here in Bozeman twice. I'm a soil scientist. I don't know how I ended up here, but I'm a soil scientist and actually did some time with the Forest Service as a soil scientist and hydrologist on the Helena Lewis and Clark National Forest. So I did work on a lot of prescribed fire projects, a lot of mining projects. We were in the beetle kill time, so it wasn't hot on timber, but I did do a lot of restoration work as well. So I've lived that world, but again, I've spent so much time now in water and sewer infrastructure that my vernacular has definitely changed, so please forgive me. I think that is actually a theme here, is that a lot of us that are dealing with federal funds and federal pass-through funds, we have a common language, and we need translators to work with us to bridge that gap between us and communities. So I had a lot to learn in managing these federal grants. I'm doing my best to try to teach local communities this language, but it really helps to have groups in between us to translate, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the things about the ARPA water and sewer grants that was really novel is the legislature wanted to make sure that everybody had a chance to get these funds. So they created a competitive grant program. They also created a minimum allocation grant program. So basically what they did is they took $150 million and they divvied it up between the cities, towns, and counties based on size and population and the amount of roads. So they still had to apply to us so we could make sure it was eligible, but they didn't have to compete. That meant that, well, what that means now is that literally every town on the map has to talk to me about their grant all the time. So we have been educating, small town clerks and county commissioners and county clerks on what it means, what it means to incorporate federal procurement, things like that. The legislature was also very clear that they wanted match for every project. And so they wanted the state's investment in water and sewer leveraged by local investment, right? And so I understand that that's a big deal with federal grants as well. So that match, I spend so much time talking about match, it's like I have an obsession with it. I will just put in a plug here that projects that were very well planned, that had really good planning documents and had gone through that public vetting, public scoping process, those went very well. I'm not saying they were shovel ready, that's a term we use a lot, but they had those background documentations, like how long will it take, how much will it cost, who are our partners, and have we gone out and done scoping? Those projects went really well, and they are going very well. So there's my plug for federal money for planning. So, got it? Okay. Others were not so ready. So I remember a call I got from a little community called Grass Range, and they had applied to us for $5 million for their water and sewer projects. And I said, what is it that you want? And they said, everything. And I said, how did you come up with $5 million? And they said they guessed. So they didn't know. She's told me that her tank was leaking and they lose a ton of water and their well pump went out. And not only that, but their lagoon has problems and so on and so forth. And so I said, well, you need to quantify that a little bit better. And she said, I don't even know where to start. I was talking to the clerk from Grass Range, who's also, I think, the vice principal of the school. Anyway, so I said, you need to contact an engineer and get some engineering estimates. And she said, do you know an engineer? And so I thought, we've got a long ways to go with some of these communities. What was really great about what the legislature put together in how they wanted to dole out these ARPA funds is they set aside some money, $750,000, for Department of Commerce to provide technical assistance. This is really novel for us, but I was really relieved to hear John mention it in community navigators. But what they did is they hired staff, and those staff went out and worked with communities. They went to commission meetings, they went to council meetings, and they worked with communities to help explain the grant program, help encourage them to apply, and it was hugely successful. So that $150 million that I told you guys about, only $1.2 million was not applied for and not eligible at the end of the day. So really incredible job. The other thing they did is they contracted engineers to go out and work with those communities to help them apply. So Department of Commerce paid the engineers to go out and work with those communities to help them fill out applications. Because we ask really crazy questions like, what's your scope of work? And for a town like Grass Range, they're like, what are you talking about? So Those advocates, those people that go out and help interpret the rules and translate between the town of Grass Range and the state of Montana and the federal requirements really helped us get these grants going and get these grants out there. And then I have a bunch of more stories, but I'll save them for later. Now what we need help with, though, is grant administration. So our applications are done, our awards are made. Now we're dealing with the grant administration piece. So federal funds, regardless of which agency they go to, we have to incorporate these basic rules. And then as they flow through a different federal agency, they pick up more rules. And so by the time they get to those local communities, you're dealing with stacks of rules and terms that are really kind of hard and confusing. And then you stack on the intent of those funds and whatever competitive process you went through those requirements. So those grant administration requirements really do stack up quickly. Just for example, I was sitting in the back preparing for an audit, reading through an 18-page compliance checklist, using terms that are they're really hard to translate. I have seen 3 models in these ARPA grants and these projects that I would like to just share with you. This is outside of us training every individual county clerk or city clerk or school district administrator's secretary on how federal grants and reporting works. That is definitely one of the models, but not one of the 3 that I want to just touch on. One of the other things about federal grants that's really huge that I've learned is that basically the recipients of this federal money, they must demonstrate that they have the technical, managerial, and financial capacity to manage federal funds appropriately or within compliance of those federal laws. That's huge. So small groups that don't have that, what do? Walk away from these federal funds? I don't think so. I think there's other ways. So one of the first ones that we've seen, and I actually think this is just an incredible result of these ARPA funds, is that a lot of these groups have partnered with counties, cities, or conservation districts as like the fiscal agents or the sponsors of these projects. And I think that's a really good model. It's a really good opportunity. The counties, the cities, the conservation districts, those, they have the established framework. They have the internal controls. They have the accounting, everything you need to manage these federal funds in compliance with the feds and with the state and everything else. But they have a project partner on the ground doing the project. Custer County, for example, sponsored a grant for an irrigation district project. The project went great, went like that. Custer County knew exactly what to do with federal funds, how to code them, how to make payments, how to follow procurement. We have other examples, the city of Billings sponsoring a irrigation grant as well. And then here in the Gallatin, with Gallatin Conservation District, they partnered with irrigators across the valley to do ARPA projects with the county as well. So it's actually this really cool conservation district, county, and the irrigators working together. The one thing that we have the opportunity for in water and sewer infrastructure is they can hire those pieces out. So another model is that they hire engineering firms, accountants, everything they need to have that administrative structure that they need, do that grant administration. I will say it does take a chunk out of your project funds, right? So every time it goes through a level, you're just peeling off the money that actually gets to the ground. I don't know another way to do this where that dollar figure goes down. And then finally, the one thing that I would like to see, and this is the thing that I think in like 2 more years, I'll be able to look back at this whole ARPA experiment and have some, really great vision of what happened and lessons learned. But for now, one of the things that I wish we had and was a better relationship with our regional associations. So Water and Sewer World, we would have the Economic Development Associations, Montana Rural Water, the Montana Watershed Coordination Council, Montana Association of Conservation Districts, many more organizations like the one that Laurel has, that we could provide direct funds to that organization to go out and help communities administer their grants, so that they would be receive funds from us to help those groups administer those grants. I know there's like a million more things, but I think we're moving to Q&A time, but I would just like to thank you guys again for giving me the opportunity to come talk to you. So.
Thanks. We don't have a lot of time left, so I would invite questions from the audience, if you have any. Got some in the back.
Hey, Nathan Deschmaker. Just a couple quick comments and then one or two questions. What I see an issue in rural resource dependent counties is, the Montana Constitution guarantees the people of Montana to a system of self-government. And the Declaration of Independence lays that out clearly. And we need self-determination, which means we can determine our own destiny within our local jurisdictions without external compulsion. And I'm not against grants as a whole, but I think we've been going down a pathway that creates more and more dependency for our local resource dependent counties. We've hamstrung the industries that provide the tax base for those counties that allowed us for those self-determining principles to govern our own affairs. So it's made us vulnerable to basically reach out for resources, in this case from the federal government down through our local jurisdictions. In mathematics, if you make a problem or if you have an issue moving forward in your equation, you can't just work forward and come up to the solution or the sum of that. You have to go back to where you made the mistake and work fresh from that point. So we need to consider and look at deregulation in relationship to these processes that's making it difficult for our rural resource dependent counties to be able to function without external compulsion and influence. So those are a couple principles on the one side of things. So two questions, I guess just one question, because part of the problem with grants coming down is a local conservation district, say, or some nonprofit gets a grant, and then they have to pay, and they hire people then, and we're like, oh, we're hiring people in the community. But then those people administer the grant, and then the money runs out, and therein lies your dependency on the next grant cycle. And what I see happening is the conditions stipulated to getting the funds tends towards going away from the cultural convictions of the people at a local level towards a hierarchical mandate that may not be consistent with their values and their cultures. And as soon as you get them into that position, they're then dependent on those resources, because now they have this group of people they've brought into their community and hired and put in offices to administer these dollars. And then 2 years down the road, the grant money's gone, and you have to sign up for the next cycle. So one of my question is, does any of you have an idea we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars you guys are discussing here, per $100 million, how much of that money is being absorbed through administrative implementation and how much is actually getting to the ground to accomplish the purpose for which the grants are being established for? Does anybody have an idea of because it's taxpayer money. And the question is, would we be better off leaving people to enjoy the fruit of their labor and the fruit of their hard work to invest into their communities than to increase the taxes on those people to funnel the money through a whole process that creates a dependency of those local communities on a program that, in my opinion, tends towards being inconsistent with the principles in the Declaration of Independence and the fundamental principles of self-government guaranteed to the people of Montana and most states under our constitutions. So the question is, do you guys have any numbers on the administrative costs of these grants in comparison to the dollars actually getting to the ground?
Thanks. Anybody want to tackle that?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. So there's a lot, a lot in there on what you said. Excuse me. The shortest answer that I can provide for you is for the funds that came down, the administrative burden was reduced by having a category just focused on the administrative needs. So, for example, there's $100 million that's set aside just to focus on the administrative needs for implementing the Inflation Reduction Act provision. So, if you're talking about how many dollars are going to the ground, that $100 million that's set aside for administrative funds is designed to allow more of those resources to go to the ground. Now, that being said, there are still individualized programs that will have maybe like a 10% administrative burden that goes along with implementing it. But there was intentionality up front around recognizing that, as Autumn said, the further you go down, the more gets skimmed off, and then by the time it gets to the ground, you don't have anything to implement. $100 million intentional around reducing that burden.
I can follow up with some slightly harder numbers real quick.
Sure.
If you'd like. So just to add to what John mentioned, speaking on behalf of an institution that serves in this role, administering a lot of these funds, the quick answer is it depends. So the 10% he mentioned is the de minimis administrative cost rate for entities that do not have a negotiated indirect cost rate with the federal government. For an entity that has a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, we refer to as a NICRA, the rate schedule would vary depending on the nature of the activities that are being undertaken in a particular agreement, but the overhead could range anywhere from 10 to about 55%. Gets pretty obscene at the high end, and a lot of times that, if that is the rate agreement in place, a lot of times those institutions that are serving as the recipient or pass-through will push for the highest administrative rate that they can get. In my case, typically, my standard or how I approach that on a project-by-project basis, even though we have a NICRA. So, for example, my NICRA will allow me to take 48.5% of every federal dollar that passes through my university. But typically, that's far more than what we would actually need for legitimate project management costs. And so my practice has been to sit down and let's say I'm serving as the fiscal agent for a project that the county needs our help with. I'm going to look at what my realistic costs are going to be to manage that and to help them and do what I need to do. And then I go to my administration and say, look, here's my itemized cost breakdown of what it's actually going to cost us as an institution to serve as fiscal agent and help with this project. And typically, what we end up billing ends up being 10% or less when I negotiate it internally that way based on a realistic cost.
Hey, Josh, let's take another question just because we're almost out of time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and excellent conversation. There were a couple comments made about restoration activities, reforestation, seeds, and so I'm curious with the Replant Act that was part of the infrastructure bill, mandating 1 billion acres of reforestation. Do we have the seed and seedling capacity to meet that mandate over the next 10 decades? So looking forward to the Farm Bill, what can be done to address what that mandate is?
There is no simple answer to. There's no yes or no answer to it. We have Forest Service nurseries and seed extractories and seed banks that are set up to store seed, but I couldn't tell you I don't have the numbers off the top of my head to see if, all right, do we have enough to plant 1 billion trees? I would say between the federal nursery system, the state nursery system, and the private nursery system, and knowing what our needs are, I think we've got the ability to put that seed stock in place.
All right. Sorry, just to speak with that, actually, we're far short when you run the actual numbers. need a several 100% increase across the board in terms of seed collection workforce capability, seed extraction and processing infrastructure, nursery production infrastructure is at less than half of where it would need to be to actually meet published targets. It's a long way to go. Happy to chat.
Sorry, and then I think we're done.
Not really a question, just one piece of information and then a request. I'm Candace Strauss with the Montana Chamber of Commerce, and I would be remiss if we didn't recognize in the spirit of the name of your panel, Rebuilding for Post-Disaster Resilience, that we're sitting less than an hour away from the Greater Yellowstone and the north and northeast entrances that experienced a 500-year historic flooding event last year. Not as much related to the ARP funds, but the miraculous convening and collaboration among federal, state, county, local, private industry, and philanthropy partners that took place here is really miraculous, and we were fortunate to host with Superintendent Shelley this past Friday during National Travel and Tourism Week a talk on the amazing road that was built in literally less than 4 months to be able to reopen that park. So I hope while you're all here, you take time to get down there and experience it for yourself. Secondly, in the spirit of small businesses, we here in Montana have upwards of 95% of our businesses are small businesses, meaning less than 50 employees. And having lived here and experienced the disasters here, also coming from Sedona, which 48% of Sedona, Arizona City is Coconino National Forest, and being there for the first full forest closure of that forest in summer of 2021. Our small businesses oftentimes get left out of this complex patchwork of public lands and municipal partners. Sedona straddles 2 counties. It's an unincorporated and city entity. Big Sky, which is a gateway community, is the same thing. 2 counties, no incorporated city. Gardner's unincorporated at the entrance to Yellowstone National Park. And it makes it very difficult to get these funding mechanisms to work for those communities and for small business owners who are there and making their living many times in 1, maybe 2 seasons. And so if as we move forward, we can put our thinking caps on how we can incorporate those entities as well in this mix, I would greatly appreciate it. And thank you all for your service.
I really appreciate that. That's been a big push, I think, for a lot of us in the West, is how do we get those small businesses that are still in our communities the opportunity to benefit from and grow from these opportunities. And you're going to close us out, I think.
I really liked her question and her comments about it, and mine do somewhat touch on it. I think because of the influx of money from so many different pieces of legislation, and back to his comment about meeting your mandatory accomplishments in all of these different ones, I look at the state level, I look at state forest action plans to have some of those key things that are being tracked for accomplishment reporting in grants, regardless of the source. But what I'm seeing is that there's a very big disconnect in communication on where that grant money is being put. I know there's CFLRP and others that have funding that has already been identified for a few years. But yet, when you have Bill or IRA come down, the different other pots of money, you're overlapping those same treatment areas. And I understand you need sometimes 2 or 3 treatments in an area, get that. But there's not necessarily, I believe, a clear tracking mechanism to help communities identify where that money is coming. You may know, being a Forest Service person sitting in a regional office or a local district office, but does the local state forestry people know 2 years out? So can you address, is that at least being discussed on how to help communities get ahead of that?
Yeah, so real quick, the short answer is yes, it's being discussed with the National Association of State Foresters and both internally as well. As you can imagine, if you put this amount of funds in the system, somebody's going to want to know how accountable were you for spending it the way it was supposed to be spent in the places that it was supposed to be spent? So what I didn't mention earlier was another part of our agency, our business operations agency, is responsible for the audit and assurance of our work. And so we're working hand in hand internally with them, externally with the National Association of State Foresters, and then they work within state to make sure that they're reporting the grants that they receive, accomplishments that are associated with it. So anyway, the short answer is yes, but it's not a perfect solution. So appreciate your feedback around more transparency is needed for the communities.
Thanks, everybody. I think we're all going to be at the reception, so feel free to come up and ask more questions. Really appreciate your time with us here today.